How's everybody doing tonight? Come on, you could do better than that. How's everybody doing tonight? Okay, there's reason for us to celebrate. There's reason for us to celebrate, even though we're thousands of miles away from the place that's being celebrated. And that's right. There's reason to celebrate, even though the Soviet Union does not exist today. Because that's like the little elephant in the kitchen that people don't like to talk about. Why are we celebrating something that had a successful counter-revolution? Well, guess what? Examples do not die. And I can tell you that the impact that the Russian Socialist Revolution had in Latin America, with Mexico immediately forming a communist party, Puerto Rico, and I'm proud because I'm Puerto Rican, it formed a communist party immediately after the Russian Revolution. And I can proudly say that one of the founders of that party was the daughter of ex-slaves, Juana Colón. In Peru, Ecuador, in Cuba, throughout all of Latin America, the impact of the Russian Socialist Revolution was felt. And throughout my life, the Russian Revolution has had a significant influence in my life personally. I'm a former member of the Young Lords, and yes, we were socialists, okay? And it is a fact of life that the rulers continue to dread to this day. Do not think that they believe that communism is dead. They know it's very much alive and well. And you know, on that note, and we're gonna be alluding to the successes of the Russian Revolution, because I do not believe that when something like that dies, representing the forward thrust in human history, that it's over. No, the next major Russian Revolution, I hope, happens right here in the U.S. Imagine the impact that would have throughout the entire world, in Palestine, in Puerto Rico, in Cuba. You know, there's a lot to rejoice. There's a lot to be successful about. And why? Because imagine a 20th century without the Russian Revolution. It would have looked completely different, you know. So let's keep that in mind, because the final chapter of the success of the working class throughout all of the globe, that final chapter has not been written, you know. So let's give socialism an applause. The Russian Revolution, let's celebrate it, because the final victories has to come. On that note, I'd like to introduce someone who has, well, we've been friends, we've been co-workers. He's also been my boss. And he was instrumental in my understanding of Leon Trotsky, you know, because throughout the 60s and 70s, many of us our minds got poisoned about the evils of Leon Trotsky. And he helped me get clarity on a number of things, you know, and that happens to be Steve Bloom, by the way, okay, a poet. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring him up. Give him a hand. Let's give it up, y'all.
I think, let's see, can we raise it up a little bit? Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, so we're here today to read a poem, which I wrote, and I have a bevy of folks to help me read the poem. Did everybody get a copy of this program, which says who the readers are and a little bit about them? What the different parts, anybody who didn't get one, they're on the table, or, okay, Ann's gonna give them out to you. That's great. And the poem is in 7 parts, including a prologue and an epilogue. I'm going to do the prologue and the epilogue, and the other readers are going to read the rest, except one of our readers is not here yet, and if he doesn't come, I'll read that part too, but that's okay. So we start with an epigram to the prologue. And over the evening forest, the bronze moon climbs to its place. Why has the music stopped? Why is there such silence? Osip Mandelstam, Russian poet, 1891 to 1938. 100 years. Prologue. How long is a century? First, allow me to note that mine is not a name which appears in your great books of history, as they recount events which are now that far in the past. Yet others who today find themselves proclaimed in this way would never have had the opportunity without my name, without my deeds, or those of my comrades. We numbered in the millions. How long is a century? Long enough that long ago all who survived the Great War, and then the Great Civil War, and then the great purges have long since joined the crowd of the dead. And so, far too many among the living reach the present moment with no understanding of how, or perhaps more important, why, one name in our books of history came to be changed over the course of a few tumultuous years from Petrograd to Leningrad. It is, however, a story you should know.
February 1917. We march in the streets for bread. It is a simple beginning. We march in the streets for bread, and we are starving. We march in the streets because we have no bread, and our children are starving. We march in the streets because we have no bread. We are starving. We cry out as we march, give us bread. Here we are, and our children too. Kill us in the street for marching, if you will. Better to die here now quickly than slowly from starvation, because we have no bread. Tsar Nicholas, however, lacks troops in the city willing to do the necessary killing. So he calls upon the Cossacks. Yet when the Cossacks arrive, they refuse to fire upon our demonstration or use their swords, cross the plaza instead to simply mingle amongst us. Some days later, we gather again in Znamenskaya Square. We gather, too, near the Nikolaevsky railway station. We have begun to arm ourselves. No longer willing lambs for the slaughter. The government sends as many police as can be mustered and 2 cavalry regiments it believes can be trusted. The police officer in command orders his men to charge and disperse our demonstration. The cavalry officer in command orders his troops to charge the police, who are dispersed instead of us. Elsewhere in the city, more regiments mutiny, come over openly to the side of the people. Crowds storm the armory, the Kretsky prison, the main artillery depot. And the poet, Mayakovsky, will write, "Beat the squares with the tramp of rebels, Arise while holding high your heads. Wash the world with a second deluge, for ours is the hour whose coming it dreads. The Tsar tries withdrawing troops from the front. As they approach Petrograd, however, railway workers refuse to transport them to their destination. These soldiers, too, express support for our demonstrations before returning to the front or simply going home. Nicholas then attempts his own journey to our city by train, but his passage is blocked at Denault Station by other railway workers, who deliver him instead to Pskov. There, a few days later, he capitulates to the inevitable and abdicates his throne. You can applaud. And the poet Mayakovsky will write, "Our gold is in our voices, just hear us sing. Meadow, lie green upon the earth, line the remainder of our days with silk. Let the rainbow offer us its color and its girth."
Assalamu alaikum. Our march to October. We're hoping to see the rainbow. Who will give us peace? Who will give us bread? Who will give us land? For these are the things we demand of our revolution. Who will take the power into their hands? In whose interests will they use that power? Politicians establish a provisional government, naming Alexander Kerensky as prime minister. We, on the other hand, revive the Soviets. Popular assemblies first created in our failed uprising of 12 years before. And from that moment, the entire problem of our revolution might be reduced to the question of power. Yes, I am able to say this to you now only with hindsight, because at first we failed to understand that this is the question. We don't even begin to understand until Lenin arrives from exile, disembarks at the Finland station, and proclaims his April thesis to a conference of the Bolshevik Party the following day. All power to the Soviets. The man for whom our city will one day be renamed, says the Bolsheviks in his April thesis, because the entire population of our revolution at the present moment can be reduced to the question of power. For Lenin, at least, all is now clear. No one will give us peace, bread, land. We will have to take these things for ourselves. We will have to take these things for ourselves. All power to the Soviets. At first, merely a cry in the wilderness by Lenin, along with a tiny minority among the delegates at the Bolshevik conference. All power to the Soviets. After a few days of debate, an idea that becomes the new agitational slogan of the Bolshevik Party, though still a minority view by far within the Soviets. All power to the Soviets. Some months later, a dominant sentiment with the Soviet of Petrograd, but not yet for the people of our nation. All power to the Soviets. Finally, as we march into October, an unstoppable tide reflecting the will of an overwhelming majority. It has, of course, not been a straight line. From April until this moment, no real revolution unfolds in a straight line. Our premature armed demonstration during July in the streets of Petrograd, the attempt by General Kornilov to advance upon the capital drowned the revolution in blood, our blood, then crowned himself emperor. Here we find two episodes in particular that are of considerable interest to a more rounded history. But I compose a poem for you, not a rounded history. And so we won't trouble ourselves with a detailed description of these events. Instead, you may refer once again to the great books. Meanwhile, we have been living through a time unlike any we have known before, in the workplace, in the barracks, on the street corners, in railway carriages, on the tram, in shops, homes, schools. We talk with each other. We talk with people we know, and we talk with strangers. Spontaneous debate, discussion breaks out everywhere. In parks, nannies exchange views about which way forward to the revolution. As the children they care for lie asleep in their prams. You would be amazed to see the workers, 40,000 workers at the Putulov factory who will stop what they are doing and listen whenever an orator comes to speak to them. Menshevik orator, Bolshevik orator, social revolutionary or anarchist orator. It makes no difference. The workers will stop and listen because someone has come to speak to them. And then they will talk about whatever it is this orator had to say. We are reading too leaflets, newspapers, pamphlets, books. Everything of interest is devoured. And it is not the journalist John Reed informs the world. Fables, falsified history, diluted religion, and the cheap fiction that corrupts. But social and economic theories, philosophy, the works of Tolstoy, Gogol, Gorky. We come down to the front of the 12th Army. The journalist's narrative continues back of Riga, where gaunt and bootless men sicken in the mud of desperate trenches. And when they see us, they start up with their pinched faces and the flesh showing blue through their torn clothing, demanding eagerly, "Did you bring anything for us to read?" And thus we learn by talking, by listening, by reading. More important still, we learn by our own experience with generals who prefer a defeat at the hands of Germans to our revolution, with mine owners who flood their own mines, with factory owners who sabotage their own machines, with railway supervisors who disable locomotives rather than allow these things to pass into the hands of our revolution, with speculators who hoard food and everything else we lack, sell these goods at inflated prices, stash their profits in foreign bank accounts. With the provisional government, which pursues its policy of compromise with those who prefer a German victory, who sabotage mining, industry, transport, who hoard and pillage for profit. Finally, if you truly want to understand, consider the simple ways in which daily life is transformed. The rich cannot now, for example, even get their servants to stand in line for them. Imagine that. On the walls of restaurants, signs appear, no tips taken here, just because a man has to earn his living by waiting tables. That is no reason to insult him by offering a tip. All power to the Soviets, because only Soviet power will bring us peace, bread, land. No one, we have come to understand, will give us these things. We must take them for ourselves. And in this truth, you may now locate the essence of every genuine revolution. All power to the Soviets, because the entire problem of our revolution during these 8 months might be reduced to the question of power. أعطيني حريتي أطلق يدي. Give me my liberty, give me my freedom to set my hands free.
October. October, insurrection. It is a question we will answer soon. Kornilov has been turned back and our strength is at its peak. The capitalist and monarchist parties still call loudly for an end to the revolution. But we are in no mood for an end to the revolution. The moderate socialist parties still attempt to moderate, but there is no compromise except capitulation. The Bolsheviks call for a national Congress of Soviets, which will declare itself the government. And so new elections sweep the Bolsheviks to a majority in the Petrograd Soviet, as well as in Moscow, Odessa, Kiev, and other cities. At the Cirque Moderne, a rank-and-file soldier speaks to an overflow crowd. Comrades, the people at the top are always calling on us to sacrifice more, sacrifice more. But those who have everything are allowed to keep everything. We are at war with Germany. Would we invite the German generals to serve on our staff? Well, we are at war with the capitalists too, yet we invite them into our government. When the land belongs to the peasants, when the factories belong to the workers, when the power belongs to the Soviets, then we will have something we can surely fight for. John Reed visits the Smolny Institute on the outskirts of Petrograd, once a religious school for upper-class women, now organizing center for the revolution. More than 100 huge rooms, he writes, on their doors enameled plaques, still informing passers-by that within was ladies' classroom number 4 or teacher's bureau. But over these hang crudely lettered signs, evidence of the vitality of the new order. Central Committee of the Petrograd Soviet, Union of Socialist Soldiers, Central Committee of the All Russia Trade Unions. You are always welcome at Smolny if you are poor and hungry. Louise Bryant, another journalist from the USA who travels to Russia along with Reed, informs her readers. All we have to eat is cabbage soup and black bread. We are always thankful for it, however, afraid that perhaps tomorrow even this will no longer be available. Meetings at Smolny often last until 4 in the morning. No matter how late they go, the streetcar workers keep the line to the institute open. And even when snow shuts down the rest of the city, these trams continue to run. At Smolny, Reed interviews Leon Trotsky. I went up to a small bare room in the attic. Few questions from me were necessary. Now, during the revolution, Trotsky tells him, one sees revolts of peasants who are tired of waiting for their promised land. And all over the country, among all the toiling classes, the same disgust is evident. The Cadet Party represents the counter-revolution. On the other side, the Soviets represent the cause of the people. Between the two camps, there are no groups of serious importance. C'est la lutte finale. After German warships attack the Russian Navy in the Gulf of Riga, rumors abound that the provisional government will soon retreat from Petrograd. Mikhail Rodzianko, leader of the constitutional monarchist faction, writes openly in the newspaper of the Cadet Party. The taking of Petrograd by the Germans would be a blessing because it will destroy the Soviets and rid us of the revolutionary Baltic Fleet. Some fear that if Petrograd is lost, the Central Revolutionary Organization will be destroyed. To this I answer that I will rejoice if all these organizations are destroyed. Meanwhile, these organizations begin to consider the question of an armed uprising. At an all-night meeting of the Bolshevik Central Committee, Lenin and Trotsky alone, among the party leaders, speak for this alternative. A vote is taken. Insurrection is defeated. At the same meeting, there are, however, also delegates from the Petrograd workers and from the garrison. One takes the floor, his face livid. I speak for the Petrograd proletariat. We favor insurrection. Have it your own way, but if you allow the Soviets to be destroyed, we're through with you. Another vote is held. Insurrection carries the day. Lenin publishes his letter to the comrades, presenting this matter in its simplest terms. Either we must abandon our slogan, all power to the Soviets, or we must make an insurrection. There is no middle course. In an attempt to disarm the revolution, the provisional government orders the Petrograd garrison to the front. The garrison refuses to leave the city. Delegations of soldiers arrive, each carrying the same message from the rank and file in the trenches. Yes, the front needs reinforcements, but it is more important for you to remain where you are, to defend Petrograd, to defend the revolution. The soldiers' section of the Petrograd Soviets elects a military revolutionary committee which rejects any allegiance to the provisional government. A meeting at Smolny, attended by many soldiers, adopts a resolution, saluting the creation of the Military Revolutionary Committee.
Let us pause for a moment at this point to remind ourselves that although I recount for you, as I must, of course, the history of October 1917 as it is told most often, a saga of leaders, of committees, of formal assemblies, of official decrees, this is only one part of the story and not the most important part by far. Because each of the leaders, each of our committees and formal assemblies is merely enacting the will of a mass movement which, now as in February, seeks no one's permission before deciding what to do. As early as September, peasants, tired of waiting for leaders, committees, assemblies, begin taking matters into their own hands, seizing land, executing landlords, burning down their houses. A delegation from the front delivers a message to the Petrograd Soviet. How much longer is this unbearable reality going to last? The soldiers have mandated us to tell you that if peace proposals are not presented immediately and seriously, the trenches will empty and the whole army will simply come home. If you cannot find the answer to the situation, We will chase out our enemies ourselves at bayonet point, but you will be chased out with them. Alexandra Kollontai, the press brands her a mad female Bolshevik, who was among the earliest supporters of Lenin's call for power to the Soviets back in April, the only woman member of the Petrograd Soviet Executive Committee and the Bolshevik Central Committee, also an advocate for the social and sexual emancipation of women in terms more liberating than even most Bolsheviks are prepared to accept, describes the reality. Is there altogether a single human being who does not bow to the general will? No, there are only masses of people, either for or against the revolution, for or against ending the war, for or against power to the Soviets, only masses of people in struggle and in action. There are no heroes or leaders. It is the people, the working people, in soldiers' uniform or in civilian attire, who control the situation and who record their will indelibly on the history of the country and of humankind. In the city of Kazan, the insurrection triumphs even before it begins in Petrograd. A participant relates the following question and answer. What would you have done had the Soviets not taken power in Petrograd? It was impossible for us to refuse power. 40,000 soldiers in the Kazan garrison would not allow us to refuse. Delegates for the All-Russia Congress of Soviets now begin to arrive in our city. 400 are needed for a quorum. A few days before it is scheduled, 175 are already present, 60% of them Bolsheviks. Troops loyal to Kerensky occupy the Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government. The morning of the day the Congress of Soviets is scheduled to convene, they are waiting for an attack by the revolutionary forces. Kerensky, however, has already fled the city. That evening, while a few blocks away, cafes and theaters are filled with people, the streets adjacent to the Winter Palace remain empty except for installations of revolutionary soldiers. At 10:40 p.m., the Congress of Soviets opens with election of a presidium based, as is the custom, on proportional representation for those parties which have sent delegates. 14 Bolsheviks are elected. 11 other places are divided among 3 other parties. Delegates to the Congress who are not Bolsheviks complain loudly that the insurrection is already happening in the streets. Soviet power is thus a fait accompli, not a choice for the Congress to make. Several dozen walk out in protest. The majority of delegates, however, jeer at those who walk out. Power to the Soviets is not a choice for the Congress to make. It is the will of an overwhelming majority of workers, peasants, soldiers. The sound of a blank cannon round fired at the Winter Palace by the battleship Aurora is heard at the Soviet Congress and throughout the city. Later that night, the palace surrenders with only a handful of casualties on either side, and a leaflet is distributed in the streets of Petrograd to the citizens of Russia. The provisional government is deposed. The state power has passed into the hands of the Petrograd Soviet and the Military Revolutionary Committee. The cause for which the people have been fighting, immediate proposal of a democratic peace, abolition of landlord property rights over the land, labor control over production, creation of a Soviet government, that cause is securely achieved. Long live the revolution of workers, soldiers, and peasants. The next day, Lenin addresses the Congress of Soviets. We will now, he says, begin to construct the socialist order.
Aftermath, Part 1, Flame on the Snow. Now, however, is when our troubles truly begin. For we have taken power, convinced that the workers of Western Europe, the workers of Germany in particular, will follow our lead and come to our aid. The workers of Germany try, but the workers of Germany do not succeed. And so now, our troubles truly begin. Allow me to illustrate for you by quoting the poet and novelist, the honest participant in and chronicler of our revolution, Victor Serge, who, during the winter of 1920 to 21, composes these lines. This crowd wants to live, to make life, but how many of those who are here have already been killed? The poor, tattered people, many teenagers, some children, all bearing rifles with the straps often replaced by string. The hands numb with cold of these poor people, their gray, wretched crossing of the Litany Prospect in a determined step. At the end of a bayonet, a red flag, Workers' Battalion from the Narva district. This crowd in snow under the midday sun, following coffins covered with branches of fir trees, red ribbons, flags, a gold ray is posed on the arrow of the Admiralty. Songs, the song which soars. There are prayers and sobs in this farewell from a living crowd to a crowd of the dead. Here they sleep behind a granite rampart, those hung, shot, whose throats were cut, those who died of typhus, who all gave freely and with their souls, died for the revolution. So often, those funerals on the field of Mars. 4,000 soldiers, peasants from Vyazma, Ryazan, Tver, Orel, Vyatka, Perm. 4,000 soldiers nourished on dry herrings, hard like stone that make the gums bleed, fed on 400 grams of black bread per day, dressed in this icy winter with the old coats of the Great War, beating their hands like children and laughing and shouting and humming. The room, made from the velvet blue gold of the Imperial Theater, vibrates suddenly with this clear human joy because a sovereign artist sings for them. A young girl, 7 years old, with very large black eyes, encased in a fine, small Kalmuk face, a tiny, refined spirit, precocious, sensitive, encased in a thin body, slowly debilitated by the hunger. Tatiana, the daughter of an aristocrat, whom you fondly call Tanya, Tanyucha, Tanyuchecha. She says, "Since you are a Bolshevik, answer me. Why was Lavr Andreevich shot?" "I am a Bolshevik, little Tanya, and I do not know why Lavr Andreevich was shot." Contempt for words, for the old words, contempt for the ideas which mislead, contempt for the hypocritical and cruel West which invented parliaments, the public press, the asphyxiating gases, the prison system, after-dinner literature. Contempt for all that vegetates in satisfaction with these things. Hatred for the formidable machine used to crush the weak. All disarmed humanity for the vice of law, police, clergy, schools, armies, factories, penal colonies. Hatred for those who need this system, the rich, the class hatred. the will to undergo everything, to suffer everything, achieve everything in order to finish. Inexorable will, the will to live finally according to the new law, equal work, or to die showing the way. Consciousness that the present hardly exists and that it is necessary to give everything at this hour to the future so there may be a present. Consciousness that all of us are nothing if we are not with our class, its humanity rising. Consciousness that the work ahead does not have limits, that it requires 1,000,000 arms and brains, that it is the only justification of our lives. Consciousness that a world collapses and that you can live only while giving yourself to the new world which waits to be born. So said Victor Serge. Please, as we contemplate this picture of a winter which I lived through, but you can only imagine, let me suggest that we recall other words already quoted above. When the land belongs to the peasants, when the factories belong to the workers, when the power belongs to the Soviets, then we will have something we can surely fight for. Words which were true enough when first proclaimed some days prior to our insurrection. Yet, how much truer are they now? How much truer are they now?
Aftermath, Part 2, Revolution and Counter-Revolution. Revolution tests the meaning of all truths. We pass through this flame on the snow and emerge still breathing after defeating each of the armies arrayed against us. The flame has nonetheless scarred substantial portions of our flesh, while many fingers and toes are absent now due to the sharp bite of the Russian frost. Without our missing fingers, some things become harder for us to grasp. Lacking certain toes, we have more difficulty maintaining our balance. When our trial by fire begins almost immediately, the boldest fighters, the most committed and far-sighted, those who truly comprehend what will be lost and therefore what can be won, all who are able and can be spared rush to the front against the white armies in order to help give birth to the future. A majority do not return. Those, on the other hand, who were merely swept up in the euphoria of October, but subsequently lost their nerve, those of a naturally administrative or bureaucratic disposition to begin with, as well as the outright careerists, whose sense of history extends no further than their next evening's meal. Such individuals, I am sorry to report, are attracted to our power too. These remain at home and thus survive, creating an imbalance which deeply affects the future course of events, as we are soon to discover. Ambitions for the revolution have not diminished. The means to carry them out, however, are still scarce. Louise Bryant recounts a conversation with Alexandra Kollontai, now Minister of Public Welfare. One day when I go to see her, a long line of sweet-faced old people are standing outside her door. They have come as a delegation from one of the old people's homes. Kalantai explains their presence. I have removed those who used to be in control and turned their institutions into little republics. They come every day now to express their gratitude. They elect their own officers and have their own political fights, choose their own menus. I interrupt her. What would that consist of in the present day? Kalantai bursts out laughing. Surely, she says, you must understand that there is a great deal of moral satisfaction in deciding whether you want thick cabbage soup or thin cabbage soup. Everywhere we confront the contradictions of being in power. When first appointed, Kalantai must deal with a strike of civil servants in her department who remain loyal to the former regime. They hide records, the keys to the safe, engage in other acts of sabotage. I kept saying to myself, is this you, Alexandra Kalantai, ordering arrests? Afterwards, I used to lie awake nights and wonder how I did it. But she brings a halt to the sabotage in less than 24 hours. And yes, in response to your question, we do understand that the revolution, its leaders in particular, have made mistakes, too many mistakes. Kalantai once again expresses the prevailing sentiment. I will never desert the ranks of the proletariat, even if they make every mistake on the calendar. A law of social change that would assert itself in any case asserts itself with greater force in our case because our means are so scarce. Mostly, though it is amplified also by the contradictions and by the mistakes. Not exactly the same as Sir Isaac Newton's third law, but close enough. For every revolution, there is an opposite counter-revolution. Perhaps equal and opposite, but sometimes when we are lucky, less than equal. And at least a portion of the revolution is able to survive. Still, if we are not so lucky, more than equal is possible too. And so we discover one way in which laws of social change differ from the laws of physics. Can you likewise identify for me ways in which the counter-revolution differs from the revolution? Perhaps it will help if I offer you a list of 11 names. Jean-Yves Bergin, arrested December 1937. Dies in the Gulag the following year. Andrei Bubnov, sentenced to death August 1938. Shot the same day. Nikolai Bukharin, put on trial March 1938, executed later the same month. Lev Kamyanov, executed August 1936. Nikolai Kristinsky, executed March 1938. Ivar Smilga, executed 1938. Grigory Sokolnikov dies in prison 1939. Leon Trotsky, killed by a hired assassin, Mexico City, 1940. Grigory Zinoviev, arrested 1934, executed 1936. These are, you will need to know, all members of the Bolshevik Central Committee, elected at the Party Congress of August 1917. 11 out of a total of 15 Central Committee members who survive until a decade after the insurrection. By 1940, each of them is dead, and not, as we see, from natural causes. Can you identify for me now one or more ways in which the counter-revolution differs from the revolution?
Out of this list of 11, you will also find 5 out of 7 members of the Bolshevik Political Bureau who served during October 1917. Bubnov, Kamenov, Sokolnikov, Trotsky, Zinoviev. What, you ask, might be the names of the other 2? First, let us remember Lenin, who dies in 1924, and only days later has a city renamed in his honor. Yet Nezhda Krupskaya, his widow, subsequently tells us to have no illusions. Had Lenin lived even a few years more, he too, far from having a city renamed in his honor, would have ended up in prison or in exile, an observation she makes before the purge trials and executions begin. There is then only Stalin. Alone of our original 7 political bureau members, he survives beyond 1940. Take heed, therefore, as the poet Osip Mandelstam describes this man. He rolls the executions on his tongue like berries. He wishes he could hug them like best friends from home. Can you now identify for me one or more of the ways in which the counter-revolution differs from the revolution? Neither Victor Serge nor I know why Lev Andreevich was shot. Yet I can tell you why the 11 on my list are killed. They have to be killed in order to extinguish the October Revolution. They have to be killed, along with hundreds of thousands more, sentenced to death, or who simply perish in the camps because so many struggle through the 1930s, through the 1940s, even into the 1950s and 1960s to preserve whatever might be left of October 1917. This single fact should allow you to comprehend just how strong our revolution was. Strong enough that all these human beings needed to be killed for the counter-revolution to triumph. And now, therefore, is when you might recall those who rushed off to help give birth to the future as soon as the Civil War began, and therefore are present no more. How differently might this history have turned out had they been with us still? Even more important, recall the faint of heart, the bureaucrats, the careerists who survived, because the victory here is not Stalin's alone. No single individual could ever have achieved what Stalin achieved without the active support and collaboration of so many others. Who else will you kill? Who else will you worship? What other lie will you dream up? The poet Osip Mandelstam asks these questions, demanding an answer from each and every one of them. Then he too perishes in a transit camp on his way to Siberia. Our great humanity is exhausted now. After so many years of struggle with an enemy we could send an army to repel, struggle with an enemy that gnawed at the revolution from within, struggle just with the difficulties of daily existence, enslaved once again in the factories, or by the reimposition of enforced motherhood and the drudgery of housework, the need to stand in line for everything. Many have abandoned the city to return to the countryside in the search for something to eat. And thus the lifeblood of our revolution, the vigilance by a mobilized people acting for themselves without deference to leaders or official decrees, has been drained away. In its place, the death blood of bureaucracy, of secret police terror, is transfused, at first merely drop by drop, but then, and soon, in a freely flowing stream coursing through every artery and vein of our new nation. There is no need to wonder why enemies of the USSR proclaim the sole surviving member of the October 1917 Political Bureau to be the rightful heir of Bolshevism rather than its assassin. The promulgation of such a myth allows them to discredit the Russian Revolution, to discredit all revolution. Nor do we have to ask why Stalin himself makes the same claim about himself up until the moment of his death. But please explain to me, it has always seemed a puzzle, why so many who imagine themselves to be great friends and defenders of Bolshevism remain, for so many decades, unable to tell the difference between the counter-revolution and the revolution.
Epilogue. The poet Mayakovsky committed suicide in April 1930, but not before he would write, "The enemy of the massed working class is my enemy too, inveterate and of long standing. Years of trial and days of hunger ordered us to march under the red flag. We opened each volume of Marx as we would open the shutters of our own house. But we did not have to read to make up our minds which side to join, which side to fight on. Let fame trudge after genius like an inconsolable widow to a funeral march. Die then, my verse, die like a common soldier." Mayakovsky and his verse were, as we know from all that is recounted above, not the only ones to perish by the year 1930. Many more will die. We now understand at least a bit of the how and the why in the decades to come. By the time a new century arrives, everything is dead. Even the name of our great city has been turned back beyond Petrograd, all the way to St. Petersburg. But let that be another story for another time. How does your present now judge our revolution? Is it by all of the death, all of the misery? Well, allow me to challenge any version of history which takes not into account the even greater death and misery that would have been inflicted by Kornilov or by any successor to Kornilov who might have taken power had the Congress of Soviets refrained in 1917. For when there is no middle ground, then there is no middle ground. When you must choose one side or the other, then you must choose one side or the other. When years of trial and days of hunger order us to march under the red flag, there is nothing to do except march under the red flag. I and my multitude of comrades took a great gamble with history. It is a gamble we lost, and yet our willingness to accept that risk at least gave us a chance to win. At least we gave ourselves a chance, and I can therefore look back now, even after all that has transpired, without regret, or at least with far fewer regrets than had we allowed the tide of history to simply pass us by. I have been told that it is brave to end a poem with a question. Yet doesn't every revolution end with a question? And isn't every revolution for this very reason, along with so many other reasons, of course, brave beyond measure, as brave as the poet is brave? How else then to end this poem about a revolution, in which it was my privilege to march side by side with comrades named Lenin and Trotsky, named Kollontai, Krupskaya, Serge, Bryant, Reed, Mandelstam, and Mayakovsky, side by side with all those, the named and the unnamed, who were, no matter how great or small our names might have been, never much more than the common soldiers of history. How else to end this poem except by posing for you today the bravest of the questions we asked ourselves? When your moment arrives, when your czars, as haughty as ours and seemingly even more untouchable, send their Cossacks against your demonstrations, and yet, by a renewal of the ancient miracle, these soldiers open the shutters of their house instead of opening fire. Cross the plaza, mingle with you in support of your demands. Can you comprehend that the entire problem of your revolution at that moment might be reduced to the question of power? That there is no longer any way for you to live except by sacrificing yourself to a world which still waits to be born? That no one will give you anything. You will have to take it for yourselves. That you must undergo everything, suffer everything, achieve everything in order to finish, or else die showing the way. When once again there is the need for inexorable will, can you find the courage to engage the same gamble we made with history 100 years ago? A gamble our future humanity may still hope to win, but only if you too are prepared to accept the risk. Will you take the power into your hands and thereby renew the long-cherished vision shared by so many poets and revolutionaries alike? Our vision of a time when the meadow may finally lie green upon the earth, our days lined with silk. As we listen to the golden sound of voices singing songs which echo from a distant past, wrapping ourselves in the colors and in the girth of a rainbow, which we will see at last, because only such a storm as this, only such a storm as this can ever give it birth. Thank you.